Okay, in this session, we'll be going over the end of chapter 15. It's going to be 15.3 and 15.4. We'll be continuing to explain some things about genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is used heavily in agriculture, both directly and indirectly. So when I say indirectly, I mean, as an example, dairy cows which are injected with growth hormones, which were created with recombinant DNA techniques. These help the cows make more milk. So in this example, the cows themselves are not genetically modified, but genetic engineering allowed those hormones to be mass produced. And this is similar actually to the insulin that's used by diabetics. The insulin molecule is the same as the ones normally produced in the human body, but bacteria are used as a factory to make it, so we have enough for injections. There are many directly genetically modified plant crops. A particularly remarkable crop is golden rice, which is a solution to a huge problem in the developing world. So rice plants normally make vitamin A, but it remains in the green leafy parts of the plant, not in the grain that we eat. So in the genetically modified golden rice, the genome of the plant has been modified so that the vitamin A is also part of the grain. And you can see that grain takes on that orange golden color that indicates there's a lot of vitamin A in it, just like carrots and sweet potatoes and things like that. So this is a solution to a problem in many parts of the world where people rely on rice as a staple food that might be someone's entire meal for the day. So it helps children receive enough vitamin A to avoid vitamin A deficiency, which leads to eye blindness or other eye problems and some other health problems. There are lots of genetically modified crops. Some of them are more resistant to disease. Some, called Bt crops, have been made so that the plant itself produces a toxin. And that toxin is harmless to humans and most animals, but it does kill several types of insects that would attack the crops. Others, the so-called Roundup-ready crops, are resistant to the weed killer Roundup, which allows the fields to be sprayed with the weed killer, and the crops won't be harmed, but the weeds around them will. So shown here are corn, cotton, and soybeans, the three most common genetically modified crops in the United States. And we mostly deal with plants, but the first transgenic animal that has been patented is as a food is a salmon that contains genes from another fish which allows the salmon to grow all year when they would naturally stop growing in the winter. So the result of this, the salmon doesn't get any bigger than the natural one, but it just gets to full size much faster, and that makes them a lot more profitable to farm. Now again, you're only changing that one aspect of them, not changing anything else about the salmon, just making its genes tell it to keep growing all winter. So there's nothing else different about the salmon. The meat from the salmon will be identical to meat from a normal salmon. There's no danger of consuming it. So the approval of this fish was held up for decades, but it was due to concerns about what would happen if they escaped into the wild. If these got out into the ocean, they could potentially disrupt the whole salmon population in the ocean. So to avoid this, they're bred inland in pens that are, you know, far inland and don't have any route to get to the ocean. So I think this is a good time to point out some of people's common concerns about genetically modified foods. Some people fear that they are really risky to eat, and this fear seems really natural. It seems like we're messing with the things that we eat. People are afraid that because really they don't understand exactly what's happening, they can't trust scientists to understand exactly what they're doing. So I want to talk about some of the misconceptions that people have, misunderstandings about what genetically modified organisms are. So one thing we hear in the news a lot about chemical additives in other foods. So things that turn out to be harmful. So like, oh, we've been putting these chemicals in our foods and everyone thought it was safe, and now 10 years later there's a study showing it's not safe and everybody panics. So I just want to be very clear that that's not happening with GMOs. They don't put extra chemicals into them. There's nothing that's being added to the food. You're changing the genetics of the plant, and then the plant is growing normally. So there's a few cases where it does something really weird, like maybe the BT corn, but most of the time it's just a normal natural plant. We've just changed one thing about the genetics of the plant, and its cells are growing just the same way a normal natural plant cell would grow. Okay, so definitely not adding extra chemicals into it. Some people assume genetic modification is leading to creations of these new monster species that shouldn't exist. But that's not happening. We're just making slight changes to species that do exist. We couldn't make something like these crazy hybrids you're seeing on the screen. Or they might fear kind of a Jurassic Park situation where the scientists thought they were making one change, but then they didn't account for something completely different, and then everything goes to wreck. Well, that's not happening either. So it's important to realize that genetic modification just makes very specific changes that are very small. Um, in most cases, the food part of the crop is identical to the unaltered version. You're not really eating anything different. In all cases, the scientists are very carefully changing a specific gene and leaving the rest alone. And this process is actually more reliable and predictable than breeding two varieties of a plant together, which we'll actually discuss more in the next section. Some places will give other information without backing it up. So you want to look for two things whenever you read something like that or watch a video like that. Look for evidence from a scientific study to show that something is good or bad or harmful or harmless or whatever they're trying to claim. And then see if you can find that same information somewhere else. And this is huge. With all of the news that's out there that is just completely made up, you want to look for um, replicated information. So you read something on one website, um, maybe it's a natural news website where they're trying to sell you stuff that's natural, so they claim everything else is bad for you. Um, Google it. See if you can find that same news from somewhere else, from a news site that you trust. So don't just trust one article or one video online. You want to look and see what you can find other places as well. All right, so section 4 is about uses of genetic modification in health and medicine. So we've already mentioned the golden rice giving people vitamin A, and that's awesome. There are also laboratories that have transgenic sheep and pigs, which make human proteins that can be used as medicines in people. So it's using this recombinant DNA where the genes for those proteins have been put into the sheep and pigs, and so they just create these proteins. Um, and then also, transgenic animals can be used to treat or to test treatments for human diseases. And along with insulin, recombinant DNA in bacteria can be used to make lots of other useful things like blood clotting factors for hemophiliacs and human growth hormones for humans that need it. So we've put this idea to work in a lot of different ways that are helpful to people. Gene therapy is the idea of the science of inserting genes in people, usually using a harmless virus, that replaces a missing or faulty gene, correcting or preventing a disease. And this is something that's not currently in use, but can definitely be a great tool for us in the future. This is cool. GFP stands for green fluorescent protein. It's a protein in jellyfish. There's just a model of it there, and there's some glowing jellyfish. And it can be spliced into other proteins in animals, creating proteins that glow. And we've used this to make glow-in-the-dark fish and mice and cats and other animals. And the point of this is by having such an obvious protein that you can really easily see where it is and where it's active, it's helped scientists make discoveries about how cells function. Couple of other cool things with genetics. Genetic testing is available to test the genes of couples and determine if they're in danger of passing diseases onto their children, so they can decide whether or not to have children. And a DNA microarray, that's what you're seeing on the right here. This is a cool thing. It's used to look for mRNA in a cell. And remember, mRNA is the RNA that takes the code from the genes and then takes it to be transcribed and turned into a protein. So if there's certain mRNA in a cell, you know that gene is active and it's being turned into proteins. So they can kind of compare different cells and see which genes are active. So for example, they might take a tumor cell and a regular cell and compare them. And then you get this microarray over here. And all of the green dots are genes that are only active in the regular cell, and all of the red dots are only active in the tumor, and then the yellow and brown dots are active in both the regular cell and the tumor. DNA fingerprinting is used for identifying people. So except for identical twins, no people have the same DNA. So if you take DNA from blood or from any piece of tissue and then use gel electrophoresis to make a pattern of bands out of highly variable regions of DNA, and then this pattern will be unique to individuals, so it can be compared to the patterns from somewhere else to see if they're the same. So it's used in forensics to determine whether a person was at a crime scene. So they can take a sample from a person, a sample from the crime scene, compare the pattern of bands of their DNA chunks and see if they match up. Um, it can also be used in paternity tests to determine if a man is the father of a child. So they look at the Y chromosome because the Y chromosome never undergoes crossing over. So the Y chromosome from a father should be identical to the Y chromosome in his sons. And similarly, mitochondrial DNA is passed directly from mothers to both sons and daughters. So if there's ever a question of who someone's mother is, you can look at the mitochondrial DNA. And you can see in this one on the bottom, none of them match up. So none of these are from people that are directly related. Okay, and this last section is about ethics and impacts of biotechnology. And this is huge. This is a really, really big thing as we get more and more genetic um, possibilities. We get more and more questions about the ethics and how they're impacting the world. So, for one, is the ownership of this information. So, genetically modified organisms have been patented, and even genes in the human genome were once patented when they first started to discover them. But thankfully, until that was something done until 2003, and then the Supreme Court said, wait, you can't do that. So, just discovering a gene is not creating something new. So, just because you've sequenced these genes doesn't mean you can patent them. So, that's good. Because what they were doing was saying, okay, we hold the patent to this gene so nobody can reproduce it for study and nobody can make any money off of it without, paying the patent holder. But thankfully, they can't do that anymore. But creating new genes or genetically modified organisms, those can be. The ownership of your own genetic information is a big question. So your DNA is yours, but the privacy of it is an issue. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is a law that prevents health insurance companies and employers from discriminating against someone based on their DNA. So if you get a DNA test that says you are likely to have a certain disease, your health insurance can't deny you, and you can't, an employer can't refuse to hire you based on that. But there are some loopholes in this. So health insurance can't deny you, but life insurance can still deny coverage based on a DNA test. And there's kind of a legal gray area for employers as far as workplace wellness policies. This is something that is currently trying to get through Congress. They're trying to get some more laws clarifying what's going on there. It's possible that they can discriminate in the way of um, demanding that people get genetic tests to be part of a workplace wellness policy, and then paying higher fees if you refuse to, similarly to how they'll make smokers pay higher fees because they're doing something that uh, endangers their lives more. So I'm not really sure on all the details about that. The laws are still kind of unclear. They're working on clarifying that, but I don't know if it's going to be for the better or worse. Okay, and we're going to talk a little more about whether genetic modification is okay to do. So as I mentioned before, it's actually safer and more reliable than just breeding two different varieties of a species together. So we talked about how selective breeding is choosing certain individuals of a species to breed together, and how over thousands of years we've made enormous changes to both plants and animals just through selective breeding. And over a long time scale, that's definitely successful, but it takes a long time and it involves a lot of breeding where you don't get what you want. So when you're naturally breeding two things together, the random combination of chromosomes from its parents can't be predicted. Just a reminder about how crossing over and independent assortment works. You have one cell, it goes through meiosis and makes four daughter cells, and each one is going to be completely different. So if you're mating this individual to another one, you don't know which one of these four cells is going to be the one that is used. And then, you've got the other one coming in with the sperm cells, and you don't know which of its four combinations are going to be used. And this is just for two chromosomes. For things that have many chromosomes, there's so many more combinations. The point is that when you are just breeding things together, you can end up with a combination that you didn't expect. But when you're doing genetic modification, the scientists start with one plant and they make a specific change. And they know exactly what they're changing, and they know exactly what they're testing and exactly what they're looking for. So it's a lot more reliable because you decide what results you want and then you make those results happen, and there's a lot less question happening in between. And in addition, the resulting crops have been the most tested crops ever created. So I've seen a lot of anti-GMO campaigns complaining, well, there's no independent testing on GMO crops. And this is not true. Each GM organism that's on the market now has been tested by hundreds of scientists from a lot of different places, tested in lots of different countries all over the world, and found no harm to humans by consuming them. And when they do test them, if there's a problem, if there's initial testing shows the potential for allergic reaction or some other problem, then the crop is not produced. So they don't necessarily always test these kind of things when just breeding plants together. But when they make genetically modified plants, they do test them. Now, it's true that extra testing is not required by the law, but it's happened anyway because people want to make sure that these things are safe. So while some people may have concerns about the pesticides and herbicides used on the plants, and that might be a much more legitimate concern. The crops themselves will not turn out to be harmful to humans. So it's important to realize that if that's what you're concerned about, you need to be protesting the use of those pesticides and herbicides, not protesting the use of genetic modification. Um, in summary, genetic modification is just a tool. Okay, it's not bad or good. We could use it to make things that are bad or good. And so far, they've been used to make things that are good. There are some legitimate concerns about GMOs, basically, mostly how they affect the environment. So if a genetically modified organism escapes into the wild, will it affect the ecosystem? So that's a concern that they had about the fish. If these fish that can grow really fast got out into the ocean, they could screw up the entire salmon population, which would screw up the entire ocean ecosystem. Also, because these are used so much, almost all of the corn and all of the soybeans and all of the cotton in the United States is genetically modified, it's created these giant monocultures across farmland where there's just miles and miles and miles with nothing planted except this one variety of corn or this one variety of cotton or soybeans. And this definitely affects the ecosystem around the farms. Um, this on the right is a satellite image of somewhere in the Midwest. I think it's Kansas. And each of those green dots is a field that's planted with corn. So each one is going to be, exactly the same. So we're definitely screwing up the ecosystem. And by not having any variety, it does leave um, the farming open to other weaknesses. So if there was some other disease that came and affected this corn, there's no variety in the corn. It's all the exact same strain, so it's going to be kind of weak to that. There's not going to be some corn that's stronger than others because it's all the same corn. And then consistently using the BT corn or the Roundup crops, it creates insects and weeds that are resistant to those poisons. So that needs to be managed very carefully, or it's going to make the genetic modification useless. So that's something that's always been a problem with weed killers and insect killers. But because, again, the same one is being used so consistently, it's something they really, really have to be careful to manage. And there are many other questions about the ethics of modifying DNA. So most people would agree that, okay, it's okay to use for cures for genetic diseases. You're going to save people a lot of suffering. But then they fear things like designer babies. Can the parents look at the DNA and choose which traits they want their baby to have? A lot of people are much less okay with that, and definitely not okay with what about the idea of cloning human beings. So these are questions that we don't really have time to get into in this class, and they're really more ethical than biological. But as these questions become more and more real, more possible that they're going to happen out in the real world, it's just important to stay educated about the developments in genetic science that are happening around you. So that brings us to the end of this chapter, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact an instructor.